Welcome, everybody, to a special presentation for the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention 2026. Joining us today is Peter Cozzens, who is retired Foreign Service officer. My handwriting is terrible, and you just said all this. But he is the author of over 18 books, including The Earth is Weeping, which won the Gilder and Lehrman Prize and was noted by The Economist as one of the 7 greatest military history books ever written. Today, we're going to talk about the Indian Wars of the American West, and I will get out of the way. Peter, here you go.
Thank you. Hello, folks. What I wanted to do today is just take about 20, 30 minutes and talk about the Indian Wars from a larger perspective, talk about the most commonly held misconceptions and myths surrounding the Indian Wars. Then I'd like to open it up for an extensive, I hope, question and answer discussion period when we can talk about everything from tactics to strategy in the West, to personalities, to particular engagements. I look to you for questions in that regard, and we can knock those things around for a time. You see the title of my talk, An Epic Shrouded in Myth, the Regular Army and the Indian Wars. And next slide, please. That's the next slide. Oh, that's the wrong set of slides.
We have a technical issue. Hold on a second.
That's the wrong set. Sorry, folks.
All right. Well, we have some slight technical issues. Hold on just a moment. Is this the original set?
That's the original set.
All right, hold on a second here. Sorry about this, folks, but I'm looking for the email. One second. All right. I see what happened, actually. This is actually my fault because there's 2 versions of it. There's a PDF version, which is what I had up, and there's a PowerPoint version, which is not the one that I had up. So let's fix this. All right. So this is the 40-slide version.
We wanted the shorter one.
All right. 1 second. I've got the shorter one. So sorry about this, folks. And you, Peter, too. I apologize.
No, that's all right.
All right. So you're not the only person who's uncomfortable with the latest technology, I assure you.
Well, you're ahead of me, that's for sure. I couldn't do all these things.
All right. Oops. All right, there we go. There we go. Now we're cooking with gas. All right. Next slide will be this one.
As I was going to say, to some degree, myths and misconceptions always distort history. But I believe that the Indian Wars of the American West are unusually susceptible to this. For 136 years since the tragedy at Wounded Knee, much of both popular and academic history and film and fiction has depicted the era as sort of an absolute struggle between good and evil, reversing the roles of heroes and villains as necessary to accommodate a changing national conscience. When I grew up, it was good army, bad Indians. And of course, that has flipped. I say in the first 80 years after the tragedy at Wounded Knee, which in effect ended the Indian Wars, the nation tended to romanticize Indian fighters and to trivialize or to vilify the Indians who opposed them. The army appeared as a shining knight, so to speak, of an enlightened government dedicated to conquering the wilderness and to, quote, civilizing the West and its Native American inhabitants. And of course, slide, no one better conveyed that in the cinema than the cinematic duo of John Wayne and director John Ford. Here you see, of course, two of the all-time classic westerns, Rio Grande and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, that paints the heroic picture of the Army in the West, in which the Indians are no more than a one-dimensional cutout backdrop. Well, in 1970, the story reversed itself, and the pendulum swung in the opposite extreme. Americans were developing an acute sense of the wrongs, the countless wrongs that had been done to the Indians. This was the year of the American Indian Movement, AIM. The Vietnam War, of course, was going on, and that also raised consciousness of the wrongs done to the Indians. Then in 1970, slide, along comes D. Brown's elegantly written and passionately wrought Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, an Indian history of the American West, and later that same year, the movie Little Big Man. Now, both of these, but particularly Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, shaped a new saga that articulated the nation's feelings of guilt in the public mind. In Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the government and the Army came to be seen as willful exterminators of Native people in the West. This book has maintained a classic status, although it is really a one-dimensional approach to the subject, in which, again, the Indians can do no wrong and the government and Army can do no right, and in which the story is told exclusively from a limited Indian point of view, with no effort at achieving balance in the story. Now, what I've tried to do, slide, in The Earth is Weeping, is bring a historical balance to the story of the Indian Wars. I hesitate to use the word restore a balance because, again, it's the pendulum swings that have defined our understanding of the Indian Wars. Of course, the first step to presenting a balanced history of anything is to strip away the myths or misconceptions that surround the era or the event. There are too many misconceptions for us to cover them all this afternoon. So what I'd like to do is address what I consider to be the three most egregious and commonly held myths or misconceptions about the Indian Wars. Slide, please. The first of these was that the regular army was hell-bent on killing Indians. That's kind of the impression you get from, again, books like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee or films like Little Big Man. Myth number two is that the government's Indian policy was somehow exterminationist. Look to the physical extermination of the Indians. And the third myth is that the Indians were somehow united, presented a united front in resisting white encroachment on their lands. So I want to go through each of these, dissect each of these, and try to convey what I think the reality was of the situation in the West during the Indian Wars. First, the notion, let's look at the notion that the regular army was held. Before we go into each of these in detail, I want to take a look at the state of the United States Army after the Civil War and at the beginning of the Indian Wars. The regular army that returned to the frontier in 1866 was completely unprepared for its mission. And even as the Indian Wars intensified over the course of the next 2.5 decades, Congress mercilessly reduced the strength of the regular army from only 54,000 officers and men in 1869 to just 25,000 officers and men in 1876, the year of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Slide, please. And you have to recall that these 25,000 officers and men were split between duty in the West and the Reconstruction South. They were, again, spread so thin that there was not an entire post in the American West that had even a full-size regiment as its garrison. And you were lucky if you had more than one battalion occupying a post at any given time, which of course made it hard to build the forces needed to defeat a tribe or tribes in any conflict. Now, declining numbers, dramatically declining numbers, as we see here, were not the only problem the Army had. We all, I think, know that the sober and purposeful volunteers who had come out by the hundreds and thousands to restore the Union were long gone. In their place after the Civil War was a decidedly inferior brand of soldier. Not all of them were, quote, the bummers and loafers that the New York Times alleged, but there were a disproportionately large number of urban poor, as well as criminals, drunkards, and perverts in the ranks. Few soldiers were well educated, and many were illiterate. You had a tremendous number of unskilled laborers in search of a steady job, flocking to Army recruitment depots, men who usually deserted when better paying work presented itself. You know, when they got out west and got close to the gold mines or other enticements of that sort. In fact, the average desertion rate in a regiment during the Indian Wars, are you ready for this? The average desertion in a regiment in the Indian Wars was 80%. So 80% desertion rate. General Christopher Auger, one of the commanders in the West, when he was asked about the quality of the soldiers, he said, you know, while the Army has a greatly improved rifle, I rather think we have a much less intelligent soldier to use it. Okay, so these were the enlisted men, not a particularly motivated lot, not a well-educated lot, not a well-trained lot. In fact, many soldiers fired their first shot with a live round when they were actually engaged with the Indians. No weapon training to speak of, very little training of any sort. Troops were sent directly from recruiting depots to their units, and it was up to the units to train them, which again was a problem because you seldom, if ever, had entire regiments congregated. So training was catch as catch can and sporadic. Okay, so those are the enlisted men. How about the officers? Next slide, please. A newly commissioned officer coming out of West Point was rudely awakened when he got to his unit out west. He found his fellow officers to be a fractious, dispirited, and generally a dissipated lot. Partly that was because promotions in the post-war regular army were excruciatingly slow. A second lieutenant coming west out of West Point faced 25 years of service on the average before he could even attain the rank of major, and between 15 and 20 years to make it to the rank of captain. If he lasted that long, he could perhaps make colonel after 37 years of service on the average. Now, given this situation, in 1877, the Army and Navy Journal predicted that within a decade, quote, there will not be 1/4 of the present field officers in the Army physically capable of supporting the hardships of active campaign. They will all be worn out old men. So in short, even the most dedicated officer found it hard to keep motivated among the rogues gallery of bickering, backbiting mediocrities that characterize the Army in the West. So that's so much for the Army in a nutshell. Now I want to go ahead and debunk the 3 misconceptions that I spoke of earlier, beginning with the fallacy that the regular Army was eager to kill Indians. Slide, please. Okay. Next slide. Now this jaunty-looking gentleman in civilian clothes is George Crook, who some of you may be familiar with. General George Crook was without a doubt one of the Army's premier Indian fighting generals during the height of the Indian Wars. He subjugated the Apaches. He subjugated the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, the Snake and Paiute Indians, and he was very active in the Sioux Wars and the Little Bighorn campaign. He also never wore a uniform to the field. He hated wearing uniforms, which is why you see him dressed. This is as he was in the field in civilian clothes. Now, during the height of the Sioux Wars, the newspaper reporter asked Crook how he liked his job. Here's what Crook said. He said, "Not much. It was a hard thing to be forced to do battle with Indians who more than not were in the right." Here's what Crook said publicly, for the record, "I do not wonder, and you will not either, that when Indians see their wives and children starving and their last sources of supply cut off, they go to war. And then we are sent out there to kill them. It is an outrage. All tribes tell the same story. They are surrounded on all sides. Their game is destroyed or driven away. They are left to starve, and there remains but one thing for them to do: fight while they can. Our treatment of the Indian is an outrage." Slide. You know, that a general officer, we can go back one, I'm sorry, that a general officer would offer such a candid, and forceful public defense of the Indians may seem implausible today because it contradicts that enduring myth of the regular Army as the implacable foe of the Indians. And Crook was one of many, far from the only high-ranking officer to protest the injustice done to the Indians. There are many other generals: John Pope, Oliver Otis Howard, Alfred Terry, who says similar things. I could go on and discuss that point ad nauseum about the degree to which the plight of the Indians disturbed senior officers and how their missions to quell Indian uprisings disturbed them as well, and how they more often or not sympathize with the hostile Indians they were charged with subduing. Okay, so much for the Army officer. And how about the government side of Indian policy? Slide, please. The notion that Indian policy was exterminationist in nature. We can and should question the morality of government policy, but it cannot be said that the government ever intended to physically exterminate the Indians. I can't stress that enough the fact that the government believed, rightly or wrongly, that the Indian way of life must be eradicated if the Indians were to survive. What is taken for granted, however, what we call today, I suppose, is cultural genocide. This would be a case of cultural genocide, to use modern terminology. But physical extermination was never contemplated. At the end of the Civil War, federal Indian policy in general was in tatters. Neither President Andrew Johnson nor Congress were able to fashion anything resembling a coherent Indian policy, which left things in the mid-1860s and into the early 1870s, as William T. Sherman said, left things to caprice and the hazard. Beside the lack of a coherent Indian policy in the years after the Civil War, another problem that made the situation worse was rampant corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was the arm of government in charge of relations with the Indians. The Bureau of Indian Affairs stank of corruption. Slide, please. This is a famous Thomas Nast illustration from Harper's Weekly at the time, showing a well-fed, corpulent Indian agent and a starving Indian. There was a popular story told at the time of a chief who described to his Indian agent to General Sherman, who then was the ranking officer in the West. He described his agent to General Sherman in these terms. He said, "Our agent is a great man. When he comes, he brings everything in a little bag. When he goes, it takes 3 or 4 steamboats to carry away his things." And perhaps Nast had that in mind when he drew this cartoon. Next slide. I'm sorry, go back. Yeah. The same slide is for both refers to both. So from this question, the corruption of the Indian Bureau and the way the Indians were treated by the Indian Bureau, question naturally arises: how did the Indians respond to the broken promises of the government and the relentless white encroachment on their lands? Constantly broken treaties that were supposed to endure into perpetuity, granting Indians particular tracts of land forever, only to have these treaties unilaterally broken just a few years afterwards. How did the Indians respond to this? And that brings us to the third misconception that I want to dispel this afternoon, and that is the myth that the Indians somehow united to resist the whites. And this, to me, was one of the great tragedies of the era, in that the Indians were not able to present any kind of a united front against white encroachment, against government mendacity, against broken treaties. Next slide. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this kind of artwork here. This is called ledger book art, and it was very common among the Plains Indians after the Civil War. What warriors would do, if you look close, you can see writing on this ledger book going vertically. It likely belonged to his storekeeper or something like the businessman, something like that. And warriors would either steal or buy or somehow acquire these ledger books, and they would paint quite colorfully over the writing or on blank pages what they considered to be the defining deeds of their lives as warriors. What they considered to be the most important martial deeds. And invariably, I'd say 80% of the illustrations in ledger books were of Indians killing other Indians, as we see here. We see, in this particular illustration, we see a Cheyenne warrior on horseback running a Pawnee Indian through with a saber. So as this picture demonstrated, pictures of this sort demonstrate, the Indians not only failed to unite in opposing the westward expansion of the whites, but they also continued to make war on one another even as this process was taking place. Now, what was the reason for that? It was because intertribal warfare was too deeply ingrained in their cultures for them to act otherwise. The tribes in the West, with very few exceptions, were warrior cultures, and a man's entire self-worth, his place in society, his rank in society, was defined by the martial deeds he had performed, and generally that was against other Indians. The wars they fought, again, were for martial honors, for land, to steal horses, to steal women. By the time the whites began coming onto the plains and into the Rocky Mountains of the Northwest and into the Southwest, this intertribal warfare was so deeply ingrained in Indian culture that aside from a few alliances, there was no sense of Indian or Indianness, for lack of a better word, until it was far, far too late. During the course of the Indian Wars, an army officer asked a Cheyenne chief, friend of his, why his tribe preyed on their pro-Indian warriors, why they preyed on their Indian warriors, neighbors, excuse me. And the chief said, slide please. He said, we stole the hunting grounds of the Crows because they were the best. We wanted more land. In this picture, we see a Crow Indian, dismounted, running through an unfortunate Crow Indian with his spear. Now, a Lakota chief told a government treaty negotiator something similar. He said, "You have split my land, and I do not like it. These lands once belonged to the Kiowa and the Crows, but we whipped these nations out of them. And in this, we did what the white men do when they want the lands of the Indians." Now, I don't know if the chief saw the irony in his statement, but this was exactly a sentiment that acquisitive whites determined to clear the West of Indians could readily appreciate. And one of the things that's frequently lost in the mythology of the Indian Wars are the numerous tribes that, for better or worse, accepted the white presence. These tribes, like the Shoshone, the Pawnee, and the Crow, are dismissed. For instance, in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, they're dismissed as mere mercenaries doing the government's bidding, which was hardly the case. These tribes united with the government, with the army, basically following the old axiom that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And these were tribes that were surrounded by other tribes that were superior in numbers and strength. And that's why they united with the whites. The Pawnee, for instance, were surrounded by the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Lakota, all tribes hostile to them. The Crow, surrounded by the Lakota and the Cheyenne as well. Again, tribes that were hostile to them that had long made war on them. So it was natural for them to side with the government. Slide, please. Here we have one of the premier instances of, and most impactful instances of an Indian tribe uniting with the government. Here we see a Cheyenne Lakota raid on some workers from the Union Pacific Railroad in 1867. This is during the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. And these raids by the Cheyenne and Lakota were so effective that they essentially closed down construction of the Transcontinental Railroad for a season. The cavalry had absolutely no luck tracking these Indians down. They struck too fast, and got away too quickly for the army ever to catch up with him. So what the government did was create what was called the Pawnee Battalion. Slide. Here you see some members of the Pawnee Battalion getting their orders. The Pawnee Battalion was about 200 Pawnee warriors who were paid and equipped like soldiers with army weapons, subject to something approaching army discipline, but were allowed to make war on the Cheyenne and Lakota warriors pretty much in the traditional sense. And within a matter of months, they had cleared the Union Pacific Road, driven off the Cheyenne and Lakota, and allowed the construction to resume. And without the presence of the Pawnee Battalion, it would have taken many more months, if not years, for the Transcontinental Railroad to be completed. And that's just, again, one of many examples of how tribes or portions of tribes cooperated with the military in suppressing resistance among so-called hostile tribes in the West. Another part of this myth is that the Indians were united in opposing white expansion was the notion that individual tribes were somehow united against the whites, even if the Indians overall weren't, or even if alliances were few and far between, that individual tribes, like say the Apache or Lakota or the Cheyenne or Nez Perce, had one front against. Were unified against the army. That wasn't the case either. Further compounding a difficulty for the Indians in resisting the military was the fact that every tribe had what was called, what you could call, for lack of a better term, its war faction and its traditionalist or traditionalist faction on the one hand, and its peace or accommodationist faction on the other hand. And these two factions struggled for dominance within individual tribes, and they sometimes clashed violently with one another. And just to give you an example here, particularly tragic example would be the Kiowas, who were a Southern Plains tribe. Again, I think a particularly poignant example of a tribe torn asunder. Slide, please. A young chief that you see here is named Kicking Bird. He was the acknowledged chief of the Kiowa accommodationist or peace faction. And he almost single-handedly kept the Kiowas out of the Red River War of 1874, 1875, which was the final great struggle for the Southern Plains. The Red River War was to the Southern Plains what the Great Sioux War was to the Northern Plains. The Kiowa were one of the three great tribes on the Southern Plains, and they were kept entirely out of the war by the efforts of Kicking Bird. Now, despite his success in keeping the Kiowa out of the conflict, the government coerced him into selecting a quota of supposed Kiowa instigators of the Red River War for imprisonment in Florida. Now, this was, an outrageous mistake, but the government had this idea that, okay, let's take the instigators of the conflict from the Comanche, Cheyenne, and Kiowa, send them to Florida for a year, maybe 2 years for imprisonment. That will tame them, so to speak, and then they return. Problem was, there were no Kiowa instigators to speak of, at least not more than a handful, marginally so, of the Red River War. Well, this task fell to poor Kicking Bird to try to come up with Kiowa instigators for imprisonment. So to ease the burden on his tribe, he chose mostly Mexican captives and tribal delinquents, which was a good tactic as far as it went. But he also selected a vicious war leader named Mamantai. Now, Mamantai was one of Kicking Bird's rivals, and he was a vicious leader responsible for almost all the Kiowa raids in the early 1870s. He was essentially a renegade within the Kiowa tribe. But Kicking Bird's reluctant complicity with the government cost him his life, as he was seeing the prisoners off to Florida with words of affection and a promise that their imprisonment would be brief. Mamantai said, "You think you've done well. You think you are free, a big man with the whites, but you will not live long. I will see to that." The next day, Kicking Bird died after drinking a cup of coffee. The army surgeon who treated him said that he'd been poisoned with strychnine. There had been a fatalistic element in Kicking Bird's struggle to maintain peace in the unending hatred between Indians and whites. Kicking Bird had foreseen the apocalypse. "I fear blood must flow and my heart is sad," he told a Quaker friend before the Red River War. "The white man is strong, but he cannot destroy us all in 1 year. It will take him 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years. And then the world will turn to water and burn up. It is our mother and cannot live when the Indians are all dead." With Kicking Bird's tragic words, I will conclude my remarks. But let's go over just briefly again. Slide, please. Review the 3 myths that I hope I have at least partially convinced you of the error of. The first, that the regular army was, again, intent on killing Indians. The government Indian policy was exterminationist, and the Indians somehow united to resist the whites. Slide, please. And on that note, I want to open it up for discussion, for questions on any aspect of the Indian Wars, level of tactics, strategy, personalities, different tribes, different conflicts, and not necessarily only on the Indian Wars of the West. We can also talk about other Indian wars in American history too, which I've written. I've written a book on the Indian Wars of the Old Northwest, called Tecumseh and the Prophet. Also written a war on the Indian Wars in the American South, called A Brutal Reckoning. So we can talk about any of these that you'd like.
Well, let's talk about The Earth is Weeping, the winner of the Gilder Lehrman Prize, and one of the 7 best books on military history ever written, according to The Economist. Tell us about what does this cover?
What? I'm sorry?
The Earth is Weeping, your award-winning book about the Indian Wars of the American West. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and what it covers from a topical standpoint?
Yeah, I have a question here online here from Tom Lozen about my latest book, and I'll get to that in a second. Then, The Earth is Weeping, and I've tried to give you a flavor for some of the larger issues of the book. But The Earth is Weeping, really, it's both a broad perspective of the Indian Wars of the West overall, and at the same time, it's a pretty deep dive tactically into each of the conflicts that make up the Indian Wars of the West. I treat the subject both chronologically and thematically. So you might have 3 or 4 chapters together within a general chronological framework of the fighting against the Apaches, another section on the fighting against the Nez Perce and other tribes in the Pacific Northwest, another section on the Indian Wars in the Northern Plains. Again, I try to keep this within a chronological framework and tie them together, how these struggles overlapped with one another, what general trends emerged from these individual struggles. I also go into great detail on the personalities: Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Geronimo, William T. Sherman, George Custer, Phil Sheridan, what these men were like, what roles they played, some of the misconceptions about their participation in the Indian Wars. I also talk about and devoted chapter to the Army itself, what the Army was like, which I alluded to in my remarks. what the army was really like during the Indian Wars. Its state of unpreparedness and just how what poor shape it was in, and great degree to which it relied on Indian auxiliaries. I also have a chapter dedicated to the way of the warrior, what the warrior life style was like. So I also get into the politics of it, what was behind the broken treaties, what was behind the different manifestations of ever-changing Indian policy. So it's what I hope is a comprehensive treatment of the era, looking from a tactical point of view all the way up to strategic overview of the period.
Awesome. This has just been added to my Amazon wish list, by the way. And your latest book, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, my latest book is called Deadwood: Gold, Guns, and Greed in the American West. That came out about 4 months ago. And that is the story of the great gold rush town, what the New York Times called the wickedest town in the West, the quintessential Wild West town of Deadwood. I imagine a lot of you folks have seen the Deadwood series on HBO. That's one of the things that motivated me to write the book. I wondered to myself, how accurate, how authentic was this show? What was Deadwood really like? To what extent did it really encapsulate the lawlessness, the raucousness, the wickedness of Wild West towns? And what I discovered surprised me in a lot of ways. I don't want to give up the story, but in many ways, the series was quite accurate in conveying at least the atmosphere of the time. The characters in the show were all real people, and I kind of correct the record on some of them, and in portraying the real life version of some of these people, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, Al Swearingen, and Seth Bullock. I think in many cases, the real life counterparts were even more remarkable because they were multidimensional than the characters in the show. So it's the story of Deadwood during its Wild West years, as well as a kind of looking at it as a microcosm of what a Wild West town was like. And I also talk about the Indians' dispossession of the Black Hills, something of the Sioux Wars plays into the story. So it's kind of a multifaceted look at Western towns and Western expansion through the lens of Deadwood in particular. And I think it's a fun read.
That also sounds fantastic. Here's a question from Ludi1. Have you seen the Ken Burns Revolutionary War documentary? And if so, do you believe overall that Indians were depicted in a fair and balanced way?
I have seen the series. I think that they were portrayed generally in a fair and balanced way. I think that where a generalization was made that was, again, falls into the category of the myth surrounding the American West, the myth of unified Indian resistance, you got an impression, not so much from the native resistance in the Eastern theater of the war, like say in upstate New York and elsewhere, it became pretty clear that tribes were fractured and that the five nations were at war with one another, and some supported the British, some supported the Americans. But there was a sense, kind of maybe unintentionally, because they didn't cover this in all that great detail, but that the tribes west of the Appalachians were, again, somehow united in fighting for the British against the Americans. And that wasn't really the case either. There was a lot of talk about Dragon Canoe and the Cherokee, fighting the Patriots on the frontier of Tennessee and the Carolinas. That was very true. But again, there were peace elements or accommodation elements within the Cherokee, as there were within all tribes in the west of the Appalachians. But I think overall they did a real fine job of getting into, especially the tribal actions in the principal theater of the war.
I need to see that. Tom Willison asks, which tribe was the most combat effective against the U.S. Army?
I think the Apaches were. The Apaches were one of the smallest of tribes. With Apaches, I should step back. The Apaches were a large, loosely affiliated nations of tribes. The Chiricahua being the most, how can I put it, the most determined in its opposition to the whites. The Chiricahua Apaches controlled the better part of modern Arizona, as well as northernmost Mexico. They never mustered more than maybe a couple hundred warriors, but they were expert at guerrilla warfare. They're expert at launching raids against settlements in Arizona, and then vanishing into the mountains of the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico. And the army was not able to finally track down the last of the Chiricahua resistance, which happened to be Geronimo and fewer than 24 warriors that were holding out in the Sierra Madre in 1885, 86. I mean, they were so effective in the guerrilla warfare they practiced that General Nelson Miles, who was in command of that department, he gathered together over 2,000 men to try to subjugate these handful of warriors. He was unsuccessful. What it finally took to bring about the surrender of the Chiricahua Apaches was the use of other Apaches, other Chiricahuas, and Apaches from other related Apache tribes, going into the Sierra Madre, finding the Geronimo and his men, and convincing him to surrender. And without the aid of Apache auxiliaries, heaven knows how long the fighting would have lasted against the Apaches. So I think the Apaches were particularly effective. I think in terms of more conventional warfare, the Nez Perce were extremely effective in fighting more conventional battles against the army. They were victorious repeatedly until they were confronted with overwhelming numbers. I devote considerable attention to both these subjects in the book, to really looking at them from a tactical point of view and to why these things were the case.
Great. Ludier asks, were many or any tribes originating further east involved in significant conflicts in the West? I guess the post-Trail of Tears tribes that then allied with others, or were they mostly downtrodden?
They were mostly downtrodden by then. In fact, none of the tribes that had been forced west in the Trail of Tears, those tribes being the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and a portion of the Seminoles. By then, they'd been concentrated on land in eastern Oklahoma. A lot of these Indians made the mistake of siding with the Confederacy during the Civil War. Parts of each of these tribes sided with the Confederacy. And after the war was over, the entire tribe suffered and it faced even harsher treatment from the government. So by the end of the Civil War, these tribes either were partly assimilated, trying to assimilate, or again, pretty much, for lack of a better word, downtrodden. And the closest tribe to the civilized nations in eastern Oklahoma, the Pawnee, they had nothing to do with these tribes. They were it was like completely different peoples by then.
All right. Tom Willison also asks, what was the role of the Indian Bureau? How did they support or hinder Indian policy?
The role of the Indian Bureau was to carry out federal Indian policy in as humane and equitable a manner as possible. You'd have government policy formulated that, for instance, you had the peace policy of Ulysses S. Grant, the famously termed peace policy, when he came into office, in which the tenets of that were, okay, we're going to segregate Indians on large reservations that would be large enough for them to support their traditional way of life to a degree, supplemented by government rations and farming implements, clothing, things they needed to get themselves started on the road to, quote, civilization, unquote, to try to turn the Indians of the West into farmers. So you had these policies that were implemented, well-meaning enough, but of course, bound to fail when you're speaking of, hunter-gatherer societies. The problem was the Indian Bureau, generally speaking, was rampant with corruption. And their role was to implement these policies, see to it that the Indians got what was accorded them by treaty on reservations, that they got a good start on the road to civilization, that their children were educated, that whites were kept off the reservation, that peace was maintained between white settlers and the Indians. And the Indian Bureau was notoriously corrupt, which, why I made the comments earlier about, the Indian chief who said that, our agent comes with one suitcase and leaves with 4 steamboats of good, because they were siphoning off things left and right and selling them on the black market. In many cases, you had Indian agents who were afraid of the Indians that they were supposed to be leading, and the Indians were contemptuous of them. The Army, too, recognized the corruption of the Indian Bureau, and there were constant struggle between the Army and the Bureau of the Department of the Interior for control of the Indian Bureau. The Army regularly lobbied Congress to bring the Indian Bureau into the fold of the War Department, where you'd have Army officers as Indian agents, men that could be accountable to a chain of command responsible for Indian affairs, who'd be rotated in and out of the job every 2 or 3 years, and with less opportunity for and motivation for corruption than these spoil systems appointed Indian agents who were paid, borderline salaries, who were actually almost expected to enrich themselves at the expense of the Indians. So the Indian Bureau, as it was constituted at the time, was really a hindrance rather than a help to federal Indian policy.
Reminds me a great deal of the Roman proconsuls. Okay, Ludyi asks a question. He lives near D.C., but unfortunately has not been to the new, to him, Native American Smithsonian. Have you, and has it proven to be a good resource for your writing?
No, I've been there a number of times. Unfortunately, it was not of any use to me. One of the difficulties with that museum, and I think the most common criticism, and I would venture to say from Native Americans as well, is that what the museum tries to do, it tries to give a voice to every tribe, to every Native people, and without really balancing the story according to the influence of a particular tribe or a particular collection of tribes. So you don't really get a coherent picture of American Indians in North America, and which tribes really had the greatest impact. And you have tribes, small tribes in the East Coast getting almost as much attention as, say, the Lakota or the Cheyenne in the West. And so it's not a real balanced presentation. It's trying to see a sense of telling too little about too many, and it just doesn't present a good coherent story, I don't think, of the Indians in North America. And as far as research, there really is not anything much there, unfortunately.
Well, here's a perfect follow-up question from Sean Lambert. What is the #1 place you would recommend visiting to help young kids and people who know nothing about the Indian Wars?
Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that I really enjoyed in doing my research for The Earth is Weeping, I spent a lot of time west. I mean, a lot of field research. In fact, I spent a week and a half, almost 2 weeks, traveling the Southern Plains alone. Not traveling by myself, but traveling the Southern Plains in itself. I traveled with somebody who had been a tour guide of Southern Plains battlefields. And most of the sites that we visited were on private land, on ranch land or on county or state land. Most of the Indian War sites have not been incorporated into national parks. And if you can get to them, I mean, they are really in a pristine state. Fortunately, most of the sites that are part of the Park Service are also very well maintained. And so I would recommend, and this you could do in 2 days. You could do one day at the Little Bighorn, which is an absolute must. I mean, that battlefield park is absolutely haunting. Little Bighorn, and with it the Rosebud battlefield site, which is about an hour away. The Rosebud was the largest battle of the Indian Wars of the West in terms of numbers of warriors and soldiers engaged. There were nearly 2,500 warriors and soldiers engaged in this battle. And it was fought over rolling terrain, lots of draws, lots of hillocks, and really a wild affair. And it's an absolutely pristine state. It's a state park. And this I guess be for more the advanced traveler. Take a map with you and a compass, and you're on the land as it was. For the neophyte, or again, young kids, I would say the Little Bighorn for sure. Another site that's just down the road, a couple hours south of the Little Bighorn, is Fort Phil Kearny, which is a restored frontier fort and the site of two important battles in the wars against the Sioux. That is the wagon box fight and the hayfield fight. They're all three kind of co-located there. That's a great site. I mean, then you have a restored Indian Wars fort. And the third site, if someone was down in the Southern Plains, I would say the Washita National Battlefield. That was a site where Custer staged a pre-dawn attack mistakenly on a tribe of peaceable Cheyenne Indians. And the Battle of the Washita is one of the one of the poorer episodes in the Army's performance in the West. I devote a whole chapter to that as well. But I'd say Little Bighorn, Fort Phil Kearny, and the associated battlefield sites, and then the Washita on the Southern Plains.
Okay. Folks, if we have any further questions, pop them into the chat immediately. Otherwise, looks like we're about ready to wrap up here. Peter Cozzens, I would like to say thanks so much for taking this time with us for a fascinating conversation. I've written a number of things down that I'm going to do further research on myself because I know very little about this topic, to be completely honest. And this was a pretty nice introduction to it.
Thank you. And I'm surprised that I don't know offhand of any war games that deal with these at the tactical level, dealing with, say, the Great Sioux War or the Red River War. Do you?
So there's a series from Legion War Games that has, I think, 3 games in it that does covers Adobe Walls, I think Little Bighorn, and I think there's a third one, but not very much. No, there's very little from a tactical perspective on this. There are a few higher level, more strategic games, such as Plains Indian Wars from GMT, and a couple of solitaire games designed by Joel Tappan. I think there's another one that was designed by somebody else. So there are a few, but not many. And I have played Plains Indian Wars, actually. And it is depressing to play as the Native Americans in that game.
Yeah, not a lot of chance of
no.
But for those who do play those games, my book, I think, would be of assistance in understanding the what happened, and got a lot of good maps in the books as well. A lot of maps to keep the reader oriented.
And I do recommend Plains Indian Wars to people as well. It gives you does give you a glimpse into the dynamics of settlers and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as the various pressures under the native tribes in the area.
A lot of the problems the Army faced, like trying to get enough men together, even launch a campaign, and supply problems on the plains, logistical problems, which were enormous. And then also you get to see the kind of the role of the Indian auxiliaries too in fighting with the Army.
Luigi mentions Navajo Wars, which is, I believe, a Joel Toppin design from GMT, which I have not played. It is a solitaire game. It is very well regarded. And Comancheria, I think, is another game on a related topic about along the same lines, and I think that's from Joel as well.
Okay.
So, folks, if there are no further questions, we're going to wrap the seminar up. Once again, Peter, I would like to say thank you so much for doing this with us tonight, this afternoon, as the case may be. And we'll hope to have you back on the show someday.
Okay, my pleasure, and I'm glad we got the slides worked out.
Yeah, my fault. Sorry about that. I may edit it.
For having set in 2 different sets of slides. So,
well, I am easily confused.
With responsibility there.
So, all right. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Take care.